For more than 4 decades, two people stood behind a rotating letterboard and became one of the most recognizable duos in American television. Millions of viewers watched them every weeknight, watched them laugh at the same jokes, finish each other's sentences, and move around that stage like they'd been doing it their whole lives, because, in a sense, they had. Pat Sajak asked the questions. Vanna White turned the letters. And somewhere along the way, the audience stopped seeing two colleagues and started asking a very different question. What actually was this? Was it a friendship? Was it something more that neither of them ever admitted? Or was it something the public simply couldn't categorize, because television doesn't usually give you 41 years of the same two faces sharing the same small stage? This is the story of how that partnership actually came to be, what really happened behind the gowns and the game show smiles, and what Vanna White has said, in her own words, over the years, about the man who stood beside her longer than almost anyone else in her life. Vanna Marie White was born on February 18, 1957, close to North Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Her biological parents split up while she was still an infant, and her mother, Joan, later remarried a man named Herbert White Jr., a real estate broker who raised Vanna as his own daughter. She took his last name, and in later interviews she made clear how much that relationship meant to her. She'd talk about calling him just to say good morning, decades after she'd left home. Her childhood wasn't glamorous. It was card games, board games, backyard mischief, and a fairly ordinary small-town upbringing. In her 1987 memoir, she described some of the stranger corners of that childhood: catching lizards, feeding a neighborhood alligator scraps of meat with a friend, the kind of stories that don't usually belong to someone who ends up on primetime television 5 nights a week. But somewhere in that ordinary life, an idea took root. She wanted to perform. She wanted to be on camera. After high school, she enrolled at a fashion and design program in Atlanta and dipped a toe into modeling, even competing in a state beauty pageant. It gave her stage experience, but it wasn't the goal. In 1979, in her early 20s, she packed up and moved to Los Angeles the way a lot of hopeful 20-somethings do, with more ambition than money. The Los Angeles years were lean. Vanna has talked openly about how broke she was in that stretch. At one point, she didn't even own a bed. She waited tables between auditions, chased down every casting call she could find, and hit wall after wall. She said she went through more than 100 commercial auditions without landing a single job. That's not a typo, over 100 numbers before a single yes. She eventually found an agent who could actually get her in front of the right rooms, and she booked her first commercial after a casting director asked what she had planned for later that day. Her answer, a joke about a doctor's appointment nobody was invited to, got a laugh and got her noticed. She even tried out for a game show audience once, sitting in contestants' row on The Price is Right in 1980, though she never made it up to the stage. It was a forgettable afternoon at the time. It became a strange footnote once she became one of the most famous faces in the genre. That same year, though, ambition had to take a back seat to grief. Vanna's mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and Vanna went home to South Carolina that summer to be with her before she passed away. It was the first of several devastating losses that would shape her long before the cameras ever found her. By late 1982, Wheel of Fortune needed a new co-host. Susan Stafford, who had been turning the letters since the show's earlier run, had decided to step away. The production put out a search, and Vanna, who had actually tried to get on the show before, simply because she loved watching it, entered late in the process as one of a handful of finalists. She's described that audition as one of the most nerve-wracking moments of her life. Her hands shook. Her voice wavered. She wanted it badly enough that the nerves were impossible to hide. Here's the detail that surprised a lot of longtime fans years later. Pat Sajak, the man who would go on to share a stage with her for the next 4 decades, wasn't originally on her side. He said so himself, years afterward, in a television interview, that when producer Merv Griffin leaned toward hiring Vanna, Pat actually argued for a different candidate, one with more on-camera experience. Griffin didn't budge. He wasn't just looking for polish. He wanted warmth, someone the audience would want in their living room every night. And he'd noticed something in the chemistry test between Pat and Vanna that told him this particular pairing could last. He hired her the day before Thanksgiving in 1982, and she officially started in mid-December that year. The man who initially doubted her spent the next 4+ years standing next to her. That's the kind of detail that tends to get lost in the mythology of America's favorite TV couple. Their partnership didn't start as a sure thing. It started as a risk that Merv Griffin was willing to take and Pat Sajak wasn't fully convinced of. It didn't take long for the audience to fall for her. Part of it was the calm, easy presence she brought to the board. Part of it was simpler than that. She was elegant, she was warm, and for years she wore a different gown every single night, an unofficial streak that lasted decades before she ever repeated an outfit. Fans started keeping track. The show's own numbers suggest she's worn thousands of different looks across her run. For years, she physically walked over and flipped each tile by hand every time a contestant called a correct letter. Once the board went digital in the late 1990s, her job became a matter of touch rather than turn, which sounds like a small technical shift, but it changed the entire rhythm of taping, letting the crew film several episodes in a single day instead of one. Off-camera, she was reportedly far more low-key than her on-air persona: jeans, comfortable shoes, and famously, she'd crochet blankets between takes, some of which she later used for her own children. In 2013, Guinness World Records recognized her as television's most frequent clapper, an oddly specific but very real title tied to just how many hands-together reactions she'd given contestants over the years. None of that fame came without cost, though. And 1986 is where the story turns from light-hearted trivia into something much heavier. In the early to mid-1980s, Vanna was in a serious relationship with actor John Gibson, a soap opera performer who had also worked as a model. They were engaged, and by most accounts, genuinely happy, planning a future together while her career was taking off. In May 1986, Gibson was piloting a small plane near an airport when it crashed. He died in the accident. Vanna has said she first learned about it from the evening news, then later received a phone call asking for the name of his dentist because his body needed to be identified through dental records. She's described that moment, falling to her knees the instant she understood what was happening, as one of the most devastating of her life. She took bereavement leave from the show. And then the part that made an already unbearable loss even worse. Some tabloids ran cruel, invented stories instead of simply letting her grieve. She's called that coverage exactly what it was: disgusting. What got her through it, by her own account, wasn't Hollywood or the show. It was faith, it was her family, and it was an outpouring of letters from strangers who had lost someone suddenly too and wanted her to know she wasn't alone in that particular kind of pain. She said that connection made her feel protected in a way she hadn't expected. It's also worth knowing that her mother, years earlier, had lost her own fiancé in a car accident just 2 weeks before their wedding, grief that seemed to echo forward a generation. Vanna's 1987 memoir became a bestseller and gave fans a much fuller picture of who she was beyond the letterboard. That same year, though, her image took a very public hit when old modeling photos she'd taken years earlier, before Wheel of Fortune existed for hair, surfaced in a men's magazine without, she says, her permission to publish them in that context. She'd taken those photos in the early 1980s because she needed money and didn't want to lean on her parents. She sued. The case eventually didn't go to trial, and she used a national television appearance to turn the whole ordeal into a piece of advice for other young women chasing a break in entertainment. Think hard before you do something you might regret, and trust your own instincts. Her acting resume kept growing in small but steady ways through the 80s and 90s. Guest spots on a string of well-known sitcoms and dramas, television movies, even a WrestleMania appearance. In the early 90s, she also went to court over a very different kind of issue. An advertisement that used a robot resembling her signature letter-turning role without her involvement. She won that case. By the mid-2000s, reports pegged her net worth in the tens of millions, boosted heavily by licensing. Her image and the Wheel of Fortune brand showed up on slot machines and merchandise for years, generating income well beyond her on-screen salary. In 2006, she received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, with Pat Sajak and the show's creator standing beside her for the ceremony. For years after losing John Gibson, Vanna married restaurant owner George Santo Pietro in 1990. The marriage gave her the family life she'd been hoping for. In 1992, she became pregnant, and in a moment that blended her private life with her public one, the show actually built an on-air puzzle around the announcement, letting contestants solve the words that revealed her happy news to millions of viewers at once. Shortly after that episode was taped, she suffered a miscarriage. She said plainly that there's nothing good about losing a child, especially right after sharing the news with the world. Once again, she leaned on the people around her, faith, family, and the memory of her mother, to get through it. She did go on to have 2 children with Santo Pietro, a son, Nico, born in 1994, and a daughter, Gigi, born in 1997. She and George divorced in 2002 in what was described as an amicable split, but the marriage that had carried her through motherhood was over. She often brought her kids to tapings growing up, letting them see the studio world she worked in up close. Both of them eventually built lives of their own, her son in real estate, her daughter as a tattoo artist, and both have spoken warmly, as adults, about growing up around the show. After the divorce, Vanna was briefly engaged to businessman Michael Kay between roughly 2004 and 2006, but that relationship ended without a wedding. Given everything she'd already been through, sudden loss, miscarriage, marriage, divorce, it would have made sense for her to keep her guard up. Instead, in 2012, a mutual friend brought a building developer named John Donaldson to a barbecue Vanna was hosting. She said her first thought, plainly, was that he was cute. They talked for hours that night, and it turned into a relationship that lasted, and lasted, and lasted, without either of them rushing toward a ceremony. For more than a decade, Vanna described Donaldson in strikingly simple terms. No drama, no pretense, just 2 people who let each other be themselves. She said more than once that she already felt married to him in every way that mattered, even without the paperwork. Then, on January 21, 2026, she surprised her fans by announcing that she and Donaldson had quietly married in a private ceremony. She shared the news on Instagram with a simple surprise. "We got married," explaining that after more than a decade together, they'd finally decided to make it official. The post included a photo of Donaldson carrying her in a white gown. It was a quiet, joyful ending to a very long chapter of her personal life, one that had nothing to do with the man standing beside her on television. That question, the one that followed Vanna and Pat Sajak for 41 years, never really had a scandalous answer, no matter how many tabloid headlines tried to manufacture one. What it had instead was something rarer and, honestly, harder to sell as a headline: an enormously long, remarkably steady professional friendship. Pat himself has joked over the years about how tabloids tried to cast them as everything from secret lovers to bitter rivals, when the truth was neither. He's talked about their rhythm, working intensely together for a few days at a time, then having real time apart, which he credited for keeping their dynamic fresh instead of exhausting. Vanna, for her part, has called him her brother more times than almost anything else. She said outright that in 30-plus years working side by side, they only ever argued once, a genuinely silly disagreement about condiments on a hot dog. They developed the kind